Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to number 20 in our series of CAWASA webinars, Wednesday webinars. If it's Wednesday, it's CAWASA Wednesday webinar. And this evening, we are being joined by Operators Without Borders, and we want to thank them for collaborating with us again once more. And we will also be joined, I think we had a few, about 6 people registered from the African Water Association, AFWA, although it may be about 8 p.m. at night for them, so let's hope a few of them will join us. I would like to welcome all of you on our webinar. And our presenter today is Mr. Neal Klassen, who is a policy analyst for the City of Vancouver, responsible for the city's residential water conservation, water metering programs. He has a master's degree in environmental education and communication, and 28 years as a communications demand-side management professional. Mr. Klassen was the creator of the City of Kelowna's Water Smart program, beginning in 1996, when data revealed that Kelowna residents were among the highest water users in North America. He developed and delivered strategic programs that helped reduce average residential water consumption by 25%. Mr. Klassen was also instrumental in the creation of the Columbia Basin Trust Water Smart program, the largest coordinated water conservation strategy in British Columbia. The CBT Water Smart initiative was a multidisciplinary collaboration that helped 26 communities in the Kootenay region reduce their water consumption by an average of 11% over 5 years. So we are very happy to have you to share with us all of that experience in this part of the world. And I will now hand over to you, Mr. Klassen. I will stop my share. I think I need to allow you to, just a minute. Okay. Oh, no. Let's see. Yeah, are you
good to go?
Yeah, good to go.
Okay, great. So thanks for the introduction. And you know, it's funny, those introductions get longer every year of your career. You realize at a point you got to start cutting some of those things out. So, but anyways, it's great to be here. One thing I don't think that got mentioned there is that I've done some work in St. Lucia as well, some public education work surrounding the expansion of the water treatment facilities that they have there. So I have worked and traveled extensively in the Caribbean, so I know the area, I know the region. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen here, and hopefully everybody will see it. I'm just, here we go. So let's try this. Can everybody see that? It should say conservation and communication.
No, not yet.
Not yet, no. I think we have a little technical glitch here.
A little bit of a lag?
Let me see if I sort that out. I think I've given you permission. But I don't
know. It says I'm sharing.
Bring up your desktop.
Pardon me?
Did it bring up your desktop?
Yeah, I can see it on mine.
Ouch, just a second. I think let me just stop share again and let's see what happens. Okay, there we go. Yeah, we have you now.
You can see it now?
Yeah.
Great, okay. So I'm going to talk today a bit about water conservation and also communication with your customers about conservation and other things. But to give you just a little bit more background, my career actually didn't start in water. I'm not an engineer. I'm not really even a technical person. I started my career actually in advertising. and I was the creative director of an advertising agency. And I switched discipline to water conservation. And you might not think that it's related or that there is any relation between the two, but in fact, advertising is really involved with honing in on your target audience, finding out who's going to buy your product, why they're going to buy it, how much they're going to pay for it, and then promoting that. So especially what really especially applies to the water business is the identifying targets and being very strategic in your efforts. So I think that's mostly what you're going to get out of this presentation today, is how specific we can actually get in our efforts to conserve water. So water conservation is not rocket science. I'm going to give you the secrets to the keys to the kingdom here. These are the 4 most effective methods of water conservation, and they are finding leaks, effective water rates, addressing your peaks, and plumbing codes. So again, finding leaks, repairing them, and I know we've had some talks about that already this week. Having water rates that facilitate conservation but are not punitive to your customers, addressing your peak system capacity is going to be driven by those peaks. So obviously the lower the capacity, the lower the cost of your system. And 4, plumbing codes. This is often overlooked when we talk about water conservation. A lot of times people think that water conservation is sending brochures to customers and nice little flyers, when in fact a lot of the work can be done just by changing plumbing codes. So I'll go through each one of these individually. Let's start with leaks. Now, again, I know you've talked a bit about this already. You've probably seen some presentations on system leakage, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, except to reiterate that the very first thing you want to look at if you're interested or needing to conserve water is your own system leakage. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The main reason is that it's non-revenue water. So that's water that you're paying for, but you're not charging for. So when you go after system leakage, you're not losing revenue. You're really helping with your system capacity by concentrating on system leakage. So as I say, you're reducing water use without losing revenue. And I'm going to give you a couple examples of things that have happened. These are towns that you probably would never have heard of, but we've got a town called Fernie in British Columbia. And they had astronomical water conservation given the size of the community. It seemed extremely high, and it was high all year round, so it wasn't seasonal. So that suggested that there was some internal leaks. And they did, I'm sure you're familiar with nighttime drawdown tests where they're taking a look at their reservoirs overnight and seeing if they're drawing down, and they were. So because that was usage that was not obviously residential or commercial, because it was happening all through the night, it obviously was system leakage. And so they undertook an extensive leak detection program, and they found a subdivision that had been built but abandoned. So the road was in, some of the foundations were there, and all the water services were there as well. And for some reason, the water services were all turned on. So there was about 25 homes with water services. I shouldn't say they were homes, they were just services in bare property that were running completely full blast. So when they fixed these, they just had to turn off these water services. They were really able to reduce their overall total consumption by about 25%. So finding those leaks is really important, not just on the system side, but also on the customer side. We're in Vancouver just now starting to realize that probably about 10 to 11% of our total water consumption is leakage on the property side. So we're talking the customer side. And we have a lot of non-metered customers. I know there are a lot of metered customers, at least in the parts of the Caribbean that I've visited, certainly in St. Lucia. And I also noticed that the meters tend to be at the property line and outside. Again, I don't know if that's common in the Caribbean. I know it is in Mexico, and I know it is in St. Lucia. And so often it's just a matter of taking a look at these meters because there's a low flow indicator on them and seeing if they're spinning. And if you do, we have a test in Vancouver called the Leak Brigade, and it's a summer student program where they just inspect water meters and they look for the low flow indicator. And if it's on, they knock on the door to see if the customer's actually using water. And if they're not, it's probably a leak. So again, I'm not going to dwell on it, but leaks are a very, very important part of reducing your overall water use. The second one is water rates. We have an unusual situation in Vancouver where we have about 80,000 single-family homes. About 10,000 of them are metered and 70,000 are unmetered. Coming up with a water rate is not an easy thing. But we've determined our water rate with faulty information. When we determined our water rate, we did not know the extent of residential leakage. So our water rates were actually set too low. So when customers go on a meter, they're actually paying less than they were on the flat rate, which is completely the opposite way you're supposed to go, because you want your water rates to encourage conservation without punishing your customers. To address this, a lot of utilities look at what we call, you also want to maintain financial stability. I know there are cases of cities that aggressively promoted water conservation to the point where they were not losing revenue, but they weren't making enough money to run their utility. So one good way to address this is what we call tiered rates by user or rates by user groups. So in some cities, we have different rates for commercial than we do for residential. And in the residential sector, we will have rates that, a certain level of consumption, you pay a certain amount. And if you exceed that, your charge per cubic meter goes up. And sometimes you can have 4 or 5 tiers. And what that effectively does is it allows your average customer to pay an average water bill. But your high use customers, through either water waste or leakage, are now kind of in a position where they need to reduce their water use in order to reduce their bill. And if they don't, that's okay too, because now what you're doing is you're shifting the costs of providing water to those high water users, and you're not punishing your low water users. So water rates are a tricky thing to do because, as I mentioned, you really want to make sure you maintain that financial stability and at the same time facilitate water conservation. So I know in the city where I live now, when we implemented our watering meter program, we estimated that the average home would reduce their consumption by 15%. So when we developed our water rate, we assumed a 15% reduction in water use and then calculated our rates based on that to ensure that we had enough revenue to run the utility. The third most effective method of water conservation is by addressing your peaks. Now, here in Canada, we have extreme seasonal peaks that you may or may not experience in the Caribbean, because we do have warm and hot summers, well, hot for us, and cool wintry winters. So people will irrigate from April to October, but they don't irrigate from October to April. So we have in many communities seasonal peaks, usually associated with irrigation. So in order to address that, well, you have your tiered rates, which is one. Another thing that we have are seasonal rates. So you have a base rate for your base consumption, which is usually indoor water use, and anything above that is considered seasonal water use, and we have rates for that. But we also have certain programs, for example, watering regulations, restricting water use to certain days, certain periods will help reduce your peaks, or at the very least, it will spread them out. I'll give you an interesting example that would never, ever happen in the Caribbean. And this was in the small town of Elkford in the mountains of British Columbia. And it was interesting because it was a really interesting case study. So in most communities in Canada, water use from January to March is pretty flat. And then it jumps up for the summer months, and then it jumps back down for the winter months. This town in Elkford did the exact opposite of that. So the winter months from October to January were very, very high, and the summer consumption was extremely low. And it was completely counterintuitive because most other communities go the other way. And they could not, for the life of them, figure out why they had such high water usage in winter as opposed to summer. Now, again, this is something that would never happen in the Caribbean. What we discovered was that when they installed the water lines, they didn't install them deep enough to be below the frost line. So in the winter, people would leave a tap running so that their water lines wouldn't freeze. And that's why the consumption was so high in the winter. When the summer came around and there was no risk of freezing, then they would turn the water off and the consumption would go down. So I guess the reason I'm telling that story is because you can make assumptions about where your peaks come from and where they don't come from. Like, I'm not familiar enough with the Caribbean to really know. I would assume that in some islands, agriculture would be a peak. In other islands, tourism might be a peak. I don't really know from island to island. I think it would really differ. But certainly if you look at those peaks and if you can help reduce those peaks or at least spread them out to different times, then you can reduce your water use. And here's another interesting thing. If you do the analysis, you can sometimes find out that there's only one or two users that are responsible for your peaks. You might assume that, well, everybody's using it and therefore our peaks are driven by everybody, but it could actually be only one or two customers. And if you have to only deal with one or two customers, that's a lot easier than dealing with all your water users. The next and final of the effective methods of water conservation are plumbing codes. I don't know how deeply this has gotten into in the Caribbean, but certainly the American Water Works Association and the EPA have standards for plumbing fixtures, toilets, taps, showers that allow for certain flow rates. And every year, the efficiency of these fixtures are getting better all the time. You know, we had a case maybe 20 years ago where low flow toilets performed really badly and people would have to flush them 2 or 3 times to get a real flush. So there's kind of a nervousness out there about these high efficiency toilets, but they've improved so much that they save significant amounts of water. So if you take a community or an island or a city that knows they have old plumbing fixtures, there's a couple of things you can do. The easiest thing to do is to start with new construction. Just say, okay, for everything moving forward, here are the standards. You know, your toilets can only flush this volume. Your taps and shower heads can only do this volume. There's one thing that we discovered in Vancouver. It was huge. It was accounting for about 4% of our consumption, which was what we call once-through cooling or swamp coolers, which may be a big thing in the Caribbean. I don't know, but we put a ban on the usage of new swamp coolers. So anybody, and I'm assuming most of you know what a once-through cooling system is or a swamp cooler is. If not, at the end of this presentation, I'll have time for questions, but they're extremely high users of water. So we've banned them for new construction, and we have a 5 to 7 year period where people with existing water once-through systems can have time to replace them because they're huge wasters of water. But you know, that's a really big and really easy win, is to look at your construction standards, your design standards, and see what those plumbing codes are, and try to as much as you can match the AWWA or the EPA standards from the United States. Yeah, so as I said, there standards for new construction. In many communities, they actually offer rebates. You know, they'll, especially places that have problems with wastewater capacity, and they're looking at expanding their wastewater systems. They've done the math. There's a town just north of us called Vernon, and they actually found it was more efficient for them to provide an incentive to pay everybody $50 to replace their toilet and reduce sewer consumption than it was to increase the actual size of the wastewater capacity. So sometimes you really got to look at what makes sense. You know, do you want to expand your system, or do you want to reduce your use? So those are essentially the 4 main ways to reduce water. And you'll notice none of them involve sending flyers to customers, doing videos. Large outreach programs tend to not be very effective. Programs that target specific users, specific categories, specific time of use tend to be much more effective. So I'm going to move now. Oh, sorry. And this is what I'm saying, to use your meted data to identify your target groups. We, in Vancouver, for example, we have a lot of parks, and they're very visible. Playing fields, ornamental parks where people have weddings, flowers, all sorts of parks. And they're very public facing. The people in the public can see them. And so when we make a mistake in water in the middle of the day in a park, the phones immediately light up. So, and because of the size of these parks, you would think that it would make sense for us to target them for water conservation. But when we look at their actual water usage, they're only 0.2 of 1% of our total water use. So while it appears that they use a lot of water, they really don't. So it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to spend resources on a category that's so small. So if you can, you want to go through your metered data and look at your target groups and identify your water use per sector. How much is residential? How much is commercial? How much is hotels? How much is cruise ships? You know, where are these categories? And that will help you identify your target groups. And then a mistake a lot of utilities make is they say, well, we've got all these user groups, let's tackle them all. Let's just go after each one of them. Well, that might not make sense. If you don't have the money, it might make sense to just concentrate on the user categories where conservation is actually achievable. So I'm going to shift now to talking about communications. So there's really three keys to successful communications. This comes from my advertising background and communications background. And that is, you want your message to be on target, you want it to be on the message, and you want it to be on time. So we'll run through those. So on target, you want to make sure the message is received by the right people. So this is just a dumb example, but I'll give you just an example. If you find out that hotels are your biggest water user, it would make no sense to send flyers out to everybody in your community to reduce your water use, because everybody in the community is not the problem. It's one specific area that is your problem. So you really want to make sure you're targeting the right people or the right category. If you're not, you have an error or a possibility of missing your target completely. The second thing is you want to make sure that your message is relevant to the audience. So here in Canada, there's a big push to say things like, we need to conserve water because it's good for the environment. That may be the case in some parts of the world, but it's not really the case here in Canada because we have an abundance of water. Some of you may or may not know that as a country, Canada has more fresh water than any country in the world. So we don't really have water shortages. So if we go out to the public with a message saying conserve water because it's good for the environment, we're going to get rejection of our message because people know it's not relevant. They know it's not true. But if we go out and say conserve water because if we don't, we're going to have to build a new dam at a cost of $4.5 billion, and that's going to raise your rates by 25%. That's a message that's relevant to the audience. So you got to make sure you're telling them the truth and that it means something to them. And the third message is that we have to make sure that messages are sent on time. Now, I know in St. Lucia, they would have issues where they would have to shut down the water system because of flooding, for example. They had a rainfall and the turbidity of the water is too high, so they would have to shut down the water. And the big complaints were that we didn't tell them, or they weren't told on time. So people had no idea because they weren't living anywhere around the water source. It's just suddenly their water stopped, and then they would have no idea when it would be back on again. So there was a lack of on-time messaging to say, first, the water is off, and secondly, the water's back on. So you got to make sure your messages are on target, on message, and on time. So to sort of summarize what I've talked about, we've got those four main methods of conservation: addressing leakage, whether it's system leakage or customer leakage, having effective water rates, addressing your peaks, making sure your plumbing codes are taking care of all new construction so you're not just repeating the same mistakes. And then when you do communicate to your people, make sure it's on target, it's on message, and on time. So that's my presentation for this afternoon, and I'm not sure how long or short I was, but I'm willing to take questions if there's time.
Neal, perhaps you could talk a little bit about the Kelowna situation, how you were able to defer the new treatment plant or whatever the deferral was by conservation, but also how you built your communication plan, so compared with what Vernon did. Could you talk a little bit about that story? Nobody from Vernon is going to be on the call today.
Okay, good. So Kelowna is a city of about 200,000 in central British Columbia. I know most of you, if you know anything about British Columbia, you picture rain and rainforest. Kelowna is not like that. We're at the northern tip of the Sonora Desert that runs right up through the United States. So we're actually quite dry here in Kelowna. And we had a situation, we're going back to 1996 now, where they were looking at, because it's a very desirable place to live, our population is just exploding. And so the engineers did a study saying, if our consumption, per capita consumption, continues the way it is, within the next 20 years, what are we going to need to have to reach that capacity? And so there was a number of pump stations and expansions and new engineering that had to be done. And the price tag came out at about $40 million. So then they did some modeling and said, well, if we are able to reduce that consumption by certain percentages, will things start to drop off that list? And in fact, they did. So they said, you know, if we can reduce overall consumption by 5%, then we won't need this pump station, we won't need this lift station, and so on and so forth. And the magic number they settled on was if we can reduce overall consumption in the city by 15%, that's per capita, then, sorry, that's total, then we will eliminate or defer or eliminate the whole 40 million. We won't have to spend any of that. So they figured back in '96, they decided to go with universal metering because they weren't metered. And they said, if we meter and have an aggressive public education program, that will cost us about $8 million. This is 96, mind you. And then we will save 32 million. So they decided to go that route. And so I was part of the company that was installing the meters, and I did the public education program. And so that's exactly what happened. As the meters went in, it became quite clear to us that it was residential water consumption that was driving the peak. And it was summer residential water consumption. So it really came down to irrigation. We have a juice factory here at Sunripe, which was actually our highest water user, commercial water user. And you would think, well, they're your highest commercial water user, so therefore they would be an ideal target for water conservation. What we found, though, is that because of the cycle of the fruit gets picked in the fall, so they're not actually processing the juice until January and February. Well, those are off-peak months for us. There's no irrigation happening in those months. So although they were high water users, they were not contributing to peak demand. So it made no sense for us to go after them, even though they were our highest customer. And so we made those kinds of decisions, which seemed a little counterintuitive at the time, which is to ignore some of our highest users and go after one category and one category only. And that was residential irrigation. And we literally hammered residential irrigation. We implemented, the tiered rate. We did research. We found out why are customers using so much water. We found out that one of the culprits was automatic irrigation systems. So we implemented new standards for irrigation systems. We found out that a lot of the high water use was because of the soil in certain areas. It was very sandy. So we implemented a soil rehabilitation program. We did numerous different and unusual things that you wouldn't consider are conservation to drive that peak down. So at the end of 17 years after, when this program basically ended, our population had grown significantly more than even the progressions thought that we would, but we were still using the same volume of water during peak periods. So our population actually increased by 40% over that 17 years, 40%. But in terms of peak usage, our peak usage did not go up. So we were able to defer the $32 million of infrastructure expansion. So we don't have a single treatment plant because of the way that we're located. We're along a lake, so we've actually got 6 different intakes that go to 6 different reservoirs that then are gravity fed back down. So there was quite a bit of infrastructure that we were looking at. So yeah, that's how we did it here. And
how did you communicate so that you didn't bankrupt the utility? I know that's another story on communication.
Well, I actually kind of mentioned that earlier. We assumed we were going to get a 15% reduction. That was our target. So we set the rates under the assumption that we were going to get that 15% reduction. Do you know what I mean? So we knew that our total volume was going to be about the same. So we set our rates knowing that when those new customers, I don't know if I'm explaining this very well, but yeah, we basically set the rates knowing that there was going to be a 15% reduction. So we set the rates to allow and account for that.
But you did it over, if I remember correctly, Neil, it was like a 2-year period. You didn't just go in and put a 15% rating.
No, we didn't, because we were installing meters.
Bills, fake bills.
We were installing meters at the time. So what we did was we spent a year sending mock bills to our customers saying, you're still in the flat rate, but here's how much water you used. Here's how much you will pay under the metered rate. If you need help reducing your water consumption, call us. And we had programs, all sorts of programs worked out. So many customers had reduced their water use before we even implemented the metered rate. But it was a very, very extensive and intensive communication effort. It was not just throwing a couple of flyers out. It was very intensive, but at the end, it worked.
We have a question from Candice Santana. She's got a hand raised. Go ahead, Candice.
She's muted. Oh, here we go.
I forgot to unmute my mic. So quick question, based on what you're saying there, is it Neal?
Yes.
The communication plan was somewhat data driven, in that you presented data to your customers, like for example, how much water they would have been using, to get them to change their approach to water use in their household. How you found that, how effective you found that, like that data-driven communication that you would have been doing?
Okay, it's a good question. So if I can just make sure I got the question right. You're saying that we send customers information about their usage and you're asking how effective that is?
Yeah, because it was, okay, so typically when we send out communication from the sector, it tends to not be very data driven. It tends to be very generic, as you were saying, generic flyers that we would send out. But from what you're telling us here, it seems as if your communication plan involved a data driven type of communication where you would have been presenting your customers with actual data of their consumption. So that that in itself could be an influential factor on their response to you. So what I'm asking is how you found that data-driven aspect of it. Did customers cling to the data? Did they ask more questions about the data itself and the data-drivenness, call it that, of your communication plan?
Yeah, okay. So let me back up and say that we did some of this by trial and error. When we sent out our first letters comparing consumption to customers, we got the average use. So we just sent letters out to our customers and said, you're using 35 cubic meters a month. And we didn't get any response back. And so I did some surveys and I found out customers don't know what 35 cubic meters a month means. They don't know, is that high? Is that low? And so what I decided to do was I divided our city up into 14 areas. And these areas were all similar in terms of lot size, demographics. You know, some neighborhoods had small houses, other neighborhoods had big houses. And what I did was I realized that these customers need to see their consumption in context. So if you send them just a number, it doesn't mean anything. But when you send them a number, so we send a letter to a certain area of town and say you use 35 cubic meters a month, and the average in your area was 19 cubic meters a month, that gets their attention. And we had the resources to take that phone call, and because we wanted them to call. So we had the resources available to take that phone call, and if they wanted, we would actually go to their house and look and see what the cause was. Was it a leak? Is it irrigation? Is it, you know, what is it? So I guess the lesson that we learned out of this is two things. I'm hoping I'm answering your question, is that if you give a customer consumption information, it has to be meaningful. It has to be in context with something that they can understand. And then secondly, you have to have the resources to be able to take those calls and offer advice. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. And I think it's something that is definitely food for thought in how we present data to customers. Because sometimes we may want to be data driven, but as you said, you related that 35 cubic meters to something in their area.
Right.
So that they could relate it. You didn't just present that their consumption would have been 35 cubic meters, but I admire the fact that you're presenting to them their usage like that in the form of data.
Yeah.
Neil, I have, yeah, that's a good one as well. But I have one, I think I was very curious to know about your Leak Brigade summer student program and how did that work out? What sort of mechanism you had to operationalize this?
So we, as I say, our city in Vancouver, the majority of homes are not metered. We have about 70,000 unmetered homes. So, and our metered homes are large homes. So Val's home, for example, is metered. She lives in a large, beautiful heritage home. But so our strategy has been to meter the large properties. So that metering data isn't giving us a true picture of what usage is in Vancouver. So we did a pilot study about 4 years ago where we installed meters on average sized lots within the city. And we found something very interesting. We found that the leakage rate was about 25%. It was huge because we've got some very old neighborhoods in Vancouver, homes that have been there for over 100 years, homes that have been there since before World War II, old galvanized piping, you know. So we had a very high leakage rate. But without water meters, it was very difficult to detect them. Like you can use acoustic leak detection to figure out leaks in hydrants and on water mains, but not to drill down to the private property size level of how do you find that leakage without meters. So I piloted a program, and what I did is I had summer students would go to each home individually. We had a map, and they would go home, like this home, this home, this home, and they would drop a acoustic device down the we've got our service lines here are buried. I know in St. Lucia, I saw them, they're all above ground, but here they're buried and they're about anywhere from 3 to 4 feet down. So we would lower this acoustic listening device to the shutoff valve and actually listen if there was water flow. And if there was water flow, we would knock on the door and the customer would either be angry because we got them out of the shower, or they'd say, no, there's not water use here. So we'd know there was a leak. And so again, this was just a pilot program, and they did about, these two students were able to do about 2,500 homes during this pilot program. And they confirmed that our leakage rate in our private side, non-metered homes, was, you know, between 20 and 25%. That's huge. And again, for us, that's non-revenue water because all these customers are on a flat rate. So the intention was to ramp that program up because, as I say, it was just a pilot program and we were going to ramp it up this year. Unfortunately, due to COVID, we were not allowed to hire summer students. There was actually a hiring freeze. A lot of our programs got put on the wayside. So we're going to continue that program next summer. So it is still in the pilot stage, but that's essentially what we did. And I should back up and say that we actually have a provision in our bylaw that says if you have a leak on your program, on your property, you are required through the bylaw to fix it. And if you don't fix it, we'll put a meter on your property and charge you for the water. So, you know, we found some homes where the leak was under the driveway and they had to dig up their driveway to fix it.
We have another question, Neil, which is in the chat room. Just let me find, yeah, it says, I think from Madeline, were the students able to connect this work to their studies as work experience and or certification to a profession?
Yes, they were. Because not only did they do the physical testing, they also dealt with customers. So there was a public relations aspect to it. They also did statistical analysis. So if you're looking, it wasn't hardcore engineering, for example. It probably wouldn't help if you're, you wanted to be a PEng or something like that. But in terms of the course of studies, we have course of studies here, environmental sciences, for example. So I got a lot of students through environmental sciences, and it was really helpful for them. So there was a lot of statistical analysis, map making, using GIS to so we wanted to calculate which areas of the city, because it was a pilot program, were more likely to have leaks than others. So there was a whole, looking for known leaks and plotting them on a map to find areas to target. So there was some technical work involved, and yes, it did, because they were what we call co-op students here. So yes, it definitely did apply to their degree.
Are there any other questions, participants?
One thing I was going to bring up, Neal, you had a very successful toilet leakage program, and this is something that is, big in Vancouver, but in the Caribbean, it is huge. My partner and I did sort of a quick guesswork on the amount of leakage. We feel that just by fixing the toilet leakage in St. Lucia and some of the other islands, Barbados where we were, you could probably save 10 to 15% of your water leakage. And Neal made my toilet very famous because he did a video showing people how to use a little dye test and use my toilet in the video. So I want royalties for my toilet, but Neal, just talk a little bit about, because that's such a simple thing, and it costs next to nothing for people to fix that, but the conservation is huge.
Yeah, so we did a program. Now, from my advertising background, I prefer to implement programs that you can measure the results. I don't like to not be able to quantify. So this toilet program that Val is talking about was probably effective, but we don't really have a measurement tool. So what we did is we inserted what's called a dye tab. It's just a little flat peel-off sticker that we sent in our tax notice that went out to every home in the city and said, drop this tab into the tank of your toilet and see if it leaks, it'll show up in the bowl. And then here's steps to how to fix it. So we sent out over 70,000 of these, but there was no way of tracking. We asked people to call in and let us know if they had leaks, but people aren't likely to do that. So as I say, it probably was effective, but we don't know for sure how effective it actually was. But certainly toilet leaks are huge. When we did the leak brigade system or program that I was just talking about, toilet leaks were the number one thing. And the amazing part is people actually know that, oh yeah, I knew it. I thought I couldn't figure out why my toilet was making all that noise. Or there's, I've been meaning to fix it, but I just never got around to it. Toilet leaks are huge.
We have another question. Ezekiel, go ahead.
Yes, good day. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. If your non-revenue water percentage is extremely low, and is it beneficial to the company to monitor past the consumer's property, especially if that consumer has a water meter?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the whole question.
Okay,
if your non-revenue water use is low?
Is it beneficial to the company to monitor past the consumer property to identify leaks, especially if they have a meter? So going beyond the property line, I think that means. Is that right, Ezekiel?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. Well, first, a lot of people, and I don't know if this is your case, a lot of utilities underestimate their non-revenue water. And I don't know if this is an engineering thing but they don't like to see non-revenue water because it means there's system leakage. So a lot of times, if you're not metered, and this I've seen this in many municipalities, is they will attribute that non-revenue water to parks, civic facilities, or other non-metered usages, and so their non-revenue water is falsely low. We have that in Vancouver. So the first thing is your non-revenue water may not be as low as you think if it's an estimate. But secondly, if you think the leakage is just on the customer side, well, we have a program, and most utility billing programs can provide this kind of program where if consumption goes up by a certain percentage, that account gets flagged. And we have staff that will go through and say, oh, that's normal because it's irrigation, or it's not normal, or we'll end up with a list of what we call high consumption accounts that we actually call or email and say, look, your consumption has doubled by, or has gone up like 25% or 30% or whatever over our last billing period. Hey, is there an issue that you can look at? And that's right in our billing software that allows us to flag those high consumption accounts. You can do it by hand because in Kelowna, we didn't have the software to do that. So I would get Excel spreadsheets every month of all our customers' usage. And then I would actually figure out my own formulas myself to search for those high usage accounts. But it's certainly beneficial. And from a customer service standpoint, they really appreciate us calling them before they even get the bill.
We have a question from Madeline. To follow up on students' question, recruitment can be an issue in some places. This may be a small piece of longer-term succession planning and work with modest budgets. Well, I guess it was more of a comment than a question.
Okay. Well, again, you know, where we live is obviously quite different from where you live. Vancouver has 2 universities and many community colleges. So we have a big pool of good students. Like I advertise these positions and I have the pick of the top students. So very rarely do I get a bad student. A recruitment for us is actually pretty easy. So I don't, you know, obviously they may not be the case down where you are, but you know, fortunately for us, because we've got that big pool to choose from, you know, it's an advantage for us.
I see that I'd like to welcome Kevin Carter from South Florida. Could you have some comments in the chat room. I would welcome if you would wish to say it yourself. You can unmute.
Oh, sure. Thanks, Ignatius. I thank you for hosting this and getting the word out. And I put it in the chat because I wanted to include the website. But
yeah.
Neal, thank you so much for a great presentation. And I was just sharing with people to build off your comment about codes and water-saving toilets and fixtures, that in South Florida that is a real big program that we do. And we either do it through a direct rebate or a credit to their bill. So a customer essentially can get 2 to 3 months of their water bill for free. And then we also inform them they can save up to almost $140 a year. And so really it pays off for them. And the scale, I want to let people know the scale of water. I mean, 5 gallons to under 2 gallons per flush, and we did 300 of these last year. And so we've done this program for 10 years. So it's a sum of parts and it adds up. And I just wanted to also share the website, the EPA's WaterSense. And most of the time we've been able to get funding for this. So maybe in the Caribbean could be something that utilities could look out to, the banks and such, as particularly as Neal also stated, the new development. So just wanted to add on to that. Thank you, Neal, for excellent presentation.
And just to add on to that, it really is beneficial from the water. If, like in Vancouver, for example, we don't provide our own sewer services. That goes to a regional sewer system. So if we did a toilet rebate program, it's harder for us to make the same case than in South Florida, because we're only saving water on the water side. We're not saving it on the sewer side. But if you get savings on both the water side and the sewer side, you know, I think I'm not wrong, but I might be wrong. But are there still places that are just putting raw sewage with basically no wastewater treatment in the Caribbean? Because you get your biggest bang for the buck if your utility operates both the water supply and the sewer treatment.
You want to answer that one, Ignatius?
Oh, that's one. I think it's like a fast one for me. No, the situation.
Sorry, I shouldn't have brought it up.
It varies in most parts of the Caribbean. In some places, you do have treatment facilities, but in a lot of parts of the Caribbean, there are not many treatment facilities. There's still a high dependency on septic tanks around the Caribbean. So in a few municipalities, you would have, like in places like Trinidad, in the capital, so on, I think they have very good treatment facilities, and parts of Jamaica. But not most of the islands have very good treatment.
Well, you know, if they have septic tanks, that's another good case for a high efficiency toilet, right? The less water you put into the septic tank, the better you are. So.
Yeah. So yeah, some cities they would have in Bridgetown and Port of Spain. I think Candice would know a bit of that on the wastewater side, and Mr. Gill. Any other questions, colleagues? I see that I think we have some representation now from AFWA. We'd like to welcome them. That's the African Water Association. And somebody mentioned, I think it's somebody representing or has some interest in Haiti. We'd like to welcome you as well, and all the other participants who joined us today. So let us thank Neal again for a very lucid presentation, and we had a few good questions and good conversation. So I'd like to thank Valerie again for making the contact through Operators Without Borders, and that we could have had another very good presentation this afternoon in collaboration with Operators Without Borders. Next week, we are going to present on emergency management for water utilities, multiple hazard approach that will be presented by Mrs. Elizabeth Riley, of the Executive Director of the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, CDEMA, at the same time. So we will be sending the circular out. And we'd like to thank everyone again. Thank you, Neal.
Thank you. You know, we usually come to the Caribbean either for work or for a cruise. I'm not going to be down there this year, though. But you all live in a beautiful, beautiful area. So thank you for letting me be a part of this.
Highly appreciate it.
Nice to see you, Candice. Thank you for joining today. And Kevin, always good to see you. And I'm sorry you didn't pull it off in Florida for us.
You're welcome, Valerie.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Ignatius, for hosting this.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye. Thanks, Neal.
Okay, I'm Ignatius Jean, the Executive Director of CAWASA. Signing off. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
They call you Val?